welcome back to Asher Books. So today I'm going to be doing the historical romance reader book tag that was created by the lovely Jess over at Peacelovebooks. I love that she created this because I don't think there were any other tags about historical romance. If there were, I completely missed them, which is possible. But I really love the questions in this, so I felt like I really wanted to do it. As you probably know if you watch my channel, I love historical romance. They're some of my favorite romance books to read, and I've been reading them for a few years now, so I feel like I do have some favorites, and I feel like it's a subgenre that's really gained steam over the past couple of years. When I first started reading it, I felt like I didn't see as many people reading it, but now, especially since Bridgerton came out, so many people are reading it, which is so awesome, and there's so many good books coming out, and I just feel like the historical romance love is increasing. So anyways, the first question is, what was the first historical romance that you ever read? So for me, this is kind of a weird answer, and when I tell people, they're always like, why was that the first one you read? But it was Devil in Spring by Lisa Kleypas. So it's a funny story. So I always loved historical movies and kind of like historical fiction, but I had never read a historical romance, you know, your traditional mass market romance. One day, about probably 4 years ago, whenever this came out, look up the publication date because it was a new release. It had just come out. I was browsing on Amazon, saw this book cover, thought it was beautiful, and was like, I think I'm gonna check that out. It looks good. No idea that it was book 3 in the Ravenels? I was clueless, okay? Forgive me. So I read it, loved it, and then immediately, I think I actually jumped back and read The Wallflowers because I did some research and figured out that I may want to read those first, but this was the first one I read. Absolutely loved it. I think that's why this series and this book in particular remains one of my favorites because it just holds such a special place in my heart. But yeah, that's kind of how I came to, I knew historical romance existed because some of my family members read it, but I had just personally never read one until this one. Question number 2 is, what was the last historical romance that you read? And I just finished one off of NetGalley called, what was it? I'll put a picture up. I think it was The Chest of Gold by Renee, is it Yancey? Again, put a photo up, but I did not love this one. It was okay. I feel like this is kind of my own fault, and I get myself into the situation where I don't read too much about it. I just see it on NetGalley and think it looks great, you know, decide to request it, and it just wasn't my kind of historical romance, and I'll talk more about it in my wrap up, but that was the last one I actually read. But I'm actually currently, when I'm filming this, reading The Madness of Lord Ian Mackenzie by Jennifer Ashley, and loving this one. Obviously, so many people were recommending this and just screaming from the mountaintops that this was great, and they are right. I'm like halfway through, a little bit less than halfway, and so far I'm loving this one so much, and I definitely understand the hype. So I foresee giving this a high rating, but I will report back once I'm finished. Question number 3 is, what is an underrated historical romance author that you wish more people read? So I've got 2 for this one. One is Christy Caldwell. I really love Christy Caldwell's books. I've read quite a few of them, at least 4 or 5, I think, at this point, and I've really enjoyed all of them. I've given all of them, I think, at least a 4-star. Maybe one was a 3.5, but overall, I think she's a really great writer. She writes really unique stories, definitely a little more gritty, more about kind of the underbelly of London, and she has definitely some somewhat different kind of heroes. They're not always like your Duke and you know, Earl, that kind of thing. A lot of times hers are from a bit tougher beginnings, and I actually really like that. So she's got great writing. A lot of her books, or at least were, when I read them, in Kindle Unlimited, so definitely check them out if you haven't already. And then another is Annabelle Anders. I've only read, I think, 2 books from her, but really enjoyed, and she's someone I feel like I need to read more from because whenever I pick one up, I really enjoy it, but I don't hear too many people talking about her books either, so she's another one that I think more people need to read, but also I need to read more of, because I did really enjoy them when I read them. Question number 4 is, who is a historical romance author that you haven't read yet but need to? Okay, so the one that's on my list that I need to read is Beverly Jenkins. I have not read a book by Beverly Jenkins yet. I don't know why. I need to fix it this year. I'm going through and trying to figure out which one to start with. So if anyone has a suggestion, I am open to it. She's got so many books. She's got a really big backlist. So it's, she's got so many books, so many on her backlist, and I know that I'll enjoy it because so many people who have very similar reading taste to me have just loved her book. She's such a well-known author and such a respected author in this genre that I need to fix this and read a book by her this year. The other one for this one is Kate Bateman. She's someone who I feel like has become more well-known over the past year or two, but I have not read her. I do own one book from her that I do plan on trying to get to in the next few months as well. The plots for her books always really sound intriguing to me, and they always kind of draw me in, and plus the covers. Her covers are gorgeous. So those two things make me want to really try her, and I've also heard really good things. Question number 5 is, what historical romance would you suggest to people trying to get into the genre? So I know, because I've watched a few of these because they're so much fun, that a lot of people have said Tessa Dare, and I do wholeheartedly agree with that. I think Tessa Dare is a really good entry point because it's very easy writing, if that makes sense. She's a wonderful writer, but I think hers to me read a little bit more like a contemporary, just in a historical setting, and I think they're a little more relatable. They're very 21st century, and I think it makes it a lot easier for people to kind of dip their toe into it. The two that I suggest the most to friends or people who have asked is either Lisa Kleypas. So I always recommend her Ravenel series. I think they're a great place to start. That's obviously where I started, which is why I usually suggest it. I usually do recommend starting with book 1, unlike me, but I think they're also pretty 21st century. I think she has some great characters in there that are really going to grab people's attention. And the other one is Joanna Shupe. I love Joanna Shupe. It's also a different setting, so it's not your typical Regency setting. It is Gilded Age. It also takes place in the States, in New York typically. And I just think she's a great place to start. I read her pretty soon after I started reading historical romance, and I really like them. She's also got a few novellas, so if someone wants to kind of go in without reading a whole book, that's always a good place to start as well. Question number 6 is, what is your favorite historical romance of all time? This is an impossible question to answer. I don't know. I feel like it changes, and I've got like a handful that are favorites. So it's so hard to pick, but I'm gonna go with 2, and I went with these 2 because they're the ones that I have reread the most, and I feel like I just think about the most and kind of resonated, and I don't know, I just had to pick 2, right? So the first one is The Viscount Who Loved Me by Julia Quinn. I kind of go back and forth between this one and book 3, which I'm blanking on the title, like Colin and Penelope story, on which is my favorite in the Bridgertons, but I think it's this one. I just love this book. I have reread this book before, and it's such a good historical romance. It's so funny, it's witty, it's heartfelt. I love Anthony and Kate, and I am so excited to see this be brought to the screen in season 2. So excited. I'm also a little nervous because it is my favorite. But I kind of trust them, you know, I think they know what they're doing. So my second favorite, I think I'm gonna have to go with Marrying Winterbourne by Lisa Kleypas. This is book 2 in the Ravenel series. As I said, I love almost all the Ravenels. I think this one, or probably Devil in Spring, are my favorite, although I love Cassandra's story too. So it's impossible to pick, but I think I have to go with this one if someone made me pick. I love this one. I think, you know, Rhys is a self-made man. I'm a big fan of that. I loved the kind of dichotomy between these 2 characters because I think they're really different. And on the outside, they make no sense, but they work really well together, and it just seems so perfect. And I love this. And every time I talk about this book, I want to reread it. So I think that's a sign it's a favorite. Number 7 is, do you prefer new or old school historical romance? So for me, I definitely think I'm gonna have to say new. For me, I haven't read too many of the old school historical romances, but the ones I have that I think would be considered that, they just haven't been favorites. I think newer ones definitely are a little easier to read. There's less problematic elements to them, less issue with kind of being a feminist and things like that. I think some of the historical romances from, you know, the 80s or the 70s just didn't age as well, and I think some of the issues that are in those books I can kind of take a step back and understand why they are that way. But it's also a little bit takes you out of the story when you're like, ooh, don't know about that. Having said that, I know some people, those are their absolute favorite books, and that is fine. Everybody gets their own opinion, but I think if I have to pick, I've read mostly new, and I think it's, for me, I think you can kind of twist in those kind of newer themes, those, you know, feminist themes in a way that still makes perfect sense in a historical setting. Question number 8 is, what are some of your favorite historical romance tropes? Now, some of these I feel like aren't necessarily only in historical romance. I think they're in just romance and books in general, but I picked ones that I love seeing in historical romance. So my number 1 has to be marriage of convenience. I think this works really well in a historical setting. In a way, it doesn't always work in a contemporary. I love this. And I think it's also that forced proximity. I think those two kind of go hand in hand to me. But I love that, because to me, these two people are kind of put in this really hard situation and then they fall in love. And I realize in normal life that probably would not happen every time. And it didn't happen every time, but I think that's why we read the romances, right? You want to see the 1 in 100 that did fall in love through an arranged marriage or marriage of convenience. So I love those. Another favorite is The Only One Bed, which again, it's not just in historical romance, but I think the stakes are higher in historical romance because obviously if something happens in said bed, things could go disastrously wrong in historical romance, whereas I think they're a little bit less so in contemporary. So I love that. The angst, the like dynamic between the two characters is so good. And then 2 for like characters I love to see is I love a blue stocking heroine. I love a heroine who is smart, who loves like books, who loves learning, who loves kind of pushing against society norms in a way that I know so many women of the time did. We just don't always hear about them. And then for my heroes, I love this. I said this before, I love a self-made hero, you know, especially during historical times, especially during Regency. It was kind of rare to have someone come into wealth that was not born into it, which is why I think I really love Gilded Age or like turn of the century romances, because that was what was happening, right? They were making their money in things like the railroads and newspapers and things like that, and men who came from nothing were suddenly more wealthy than the aristocracy, and I just love that dynamic. I think it's really interesting and it makes for a really interesting hero. Question number 9 is, what are your favorite historical romance settings? For this one, I kind of went with, most of the ones I've read have been taking place in England, because I'd say like at least 80% of the ones I've read have taken place in England. But I love a country. I like the country better than taking place in the city. I think that just makes for a really cool dynamic. I also love a country house party, like whenever all the characters are in the same house and that's where like a large part of the plot takes place. Again, it's kind of that forced proximity thing. And I just think there's a lot of like, you know, antics that ensue when you're at a country house party. Another setting I do love, I've already mentioned, is I love Gilded Age romances. Joanna Shupe writes some of the best ones in my opinion, and typically those are set in New York. I know her new book is actually in Newport, Rhode Island, which is where the wealthy went to vacation, so I'm really excited to read that as well. But I do love seeing New York because obviously New York's a place I'm more familiar with than London. I've only been to London once, whereas New York I've been quite a few times, so it's kind of cool hearing about different locations that I'm somewhat familiar with. Number 10 is, what is the oldest historical romance that you own? For me, this is going to be 2, and I think they're from around the same time, and that is The Flame and the Flower and The Wolf and the Dove by Kathleen Woodiwiss. These were both my grandma's, and so they are from, I think, 1972. I looked before, let me check. I think they are from, yeah, 1972. So at least this one is. I think this one's maybe actually a couple years earlier because this one came out first. But they're really cool. They have like reddish color on the outside and just really cool covers, and I really like these. They're very special to me and I will not be getting rid of them anytime soon. But no, I have not read these yet, but these are the oldest ones I believe that I own. Question number 11 is, what is your favorite step back that you own? So for this one, I decided not to go with an actual step back because, I mean, of course I've got some cool ones and some that I like, but I honestly just needed to show this cover because it's a little bit crazy and it's not a step back, but wow. This is another That Was My Grandma's. I have not read this. It's Wild Bells in the Wild Sky by Laurie McBain. Does anyone know anything about this? I mean, look at the back. Look. You've got a pirate ship or a ship. You've got a guy on horses. You've got a queen. You've got a guy juggling. There's just so much. I mean, there's like a panther here. There's so much. I felt like I needed to show this. It's not technically a step back, but I think this is my favorite. Number 12 is what is historical romance release that you're excited for. So for this, I have two. The first one is The Heiress Hunt by Joanna Shupe. I know this one just recently came out. I just haven't quite got my hands on it yet. But as I've said multiple times throughout this tag, I love Joanna Shupe. So I'm really excited to read this one. And this is the one that takes place in Newport, Rhode Island. So I think that'll be a really fun setting to read about. And then the other one that I just bought, I just forgot to grab, is The Spinster and the Rake by Eve Denton. I have never read this author before. I'm not sure if this is her debut or if it's just another book from her, but I feel like I've seen this one everywhere recently, and I picked it up the other day at the bookstore, and I really am excited to read this because it sounds like a really, really cool plot. Number 13 is what creators do you follow for historical romance recommendations, and I've kind of got a whole list I'm gonna read out because a lot of the people who I follow for romance recommendations also have really good historical romance recommendations. So these are a few of my favorites. Obviously, Jess is top of the list too because she's got amazing historical romance. So I'm sure most of you are subscribed, but if you're not, go check Jess out. Honestly, the three ladies who do the historical romance readathon are great resources. So Jess, Lacey, and Lisa. They are all amazing. They have great recommendations, so I'll link those below. And then a couple others is Jenn from The Book Refuge. She reads a really big variety of romance, but she also does read really good historical romances, and she has some great recommendations and some different ones that I haven't heard of before. I get off hers. Another one is Jessen from Jessenreadsromance. I think that's her name, right? I'll link them all below. She's got an amazing channel. I love her channel. She's got really good historical romance recs, and she's another one that kind of finds the ones that I haven't heard of before. Some of them are newer, and then some of them are really older backlist, but the way she describes books always makes me want to pick them up. So definitely check out her if you're not already subscribed. And then last one is Crystal from Crystalsbookishlife because she reads a ton of historical romance. So she always has a good suggestion for something if you're looking for a new one to kind of try and find out. I get a lot of recommendations from her as well. Okay, so that was the historical romance reader tag. This was really fun. I really liked this tag, and thank you, Jess, for creating it. It was so much fun. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.